Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David McLean. I'm General Manager of RCS, and I've got the privilege of chairing this session this afternoon, one of the last sessions for this week of Beef 2018, and I'm happy to say that the seminar committee have saved the best for last, so congratulations and well done on getting to the end. Our goal within RCS as a company is to make sure that we do our best to bring, at each Beef Week, a collection of really thought-stimulating, thought-provoking speakers to you, so you can listen to people that you wouldn't normally get the access to. So no doubt you'll enjoy this afternoon. In terms of the context about what we're looking to achieve today, in a world where our consumers are becoming more and more aware of where their food comes from, and there's more and more pressure on us as an industry in food production to show, well, how do we actually go about running our businesses? What is our licence to operate and our social licence to operate on our land? In doing that, we've got to make some pretty significant mind shifts in how we approach our way to agriculture. The businesses that are going to be showcased this afternoon are all running professional, successful operations in their own right with a wealth of experience in agriculture. And our goal in bringing them to you is to hear their stories, their perspectives and their approaches on how they've gone about to ag and where they see agriculture going into the future as well. The first speaker I'm going to introduce you to is Charles Massy. So Charles is an author of 4 books, the latest of which is Call of the Reed Warbler, which I know a lot of you have already read and are excited to come and hear the man in person himself. Charles' association with RCS began in the early 90s, and so in terms of attending a number of different courses and having many robust discussions over the years with Terry and with the RCS team in that period of time there. I'm actually not going to say a lot more because I'm going to let him introduce himself as you go through and share his story. So Charles, I'm with delight and hand over to you.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks very much, David, and welcome everyone, and particular thanks to Terry, Pam and all the RCS team. So we are in challenging times, climatically and every other way, but I think it's a time of wonderful opportunity, and I'm going to spell some of them out today. So it's a simple message. We regenerate healthy landscapes. Off that comes healthy food to connect to the urban people. And with it comes healthy profits and the people and a healthy planet. And as I'll discuss directly, that's going to be huge. And why it's going to be big is because of this. We have moved into a new geological era of our Earth systems. And where I'm based at the ANU, just down the corridor, I'm still part-time there, are some of the world experts in studying not just climate, but the other 7 major Earth systems. And every time they come back from overseas, they're more depressed with what's going on. And because of humanity has tipped our planet into a new system. And I personally believe that as we move into the Anthropocene era, it's the greatest challenge that our species has ever faced. It makes world wars look like storms and teacups. It's that serious. So I won't bore you with it too much, but it's only in the last 10 years that thousands of scientists around the world have put together the picture of the Earth systems. And that remarkable blue-green planet you can see there, a lot of people don't realise that it was actually life itself that created conditions for life. It was over 3 billion years ago that bacteria actually put oxygen into the atmosphere for the first time. And over 400 million years ago, the great plants started to regulate and release the carbon cycle. So we now have 8 identifiable Earth systems, which you can see there: climate, biodiversity, and I won't go through them all, phosphorus, nitrogen cycle, etc., etc. All of them interact in a self-organising way to maintain conditions for life, which we've now destabilised. I've highlighted the top 3, climate, biodiversity, because we're now in the 6th greatest extinction event on Earth, this time caused by us, and the nitrogen phosphorus ones, because those boundaries have now been pushed into unknown dangerous territory. If you think about a steep mountain road and a guardrail, we're over that guardrail with those 3 boundaries, and we don't know what's going to happen. Do we go over? Do we have a runaway event? And of the others, all except for number 8, the ozone layer, they're rapidly approaching the safe boundaries. The key point at the bottom is that the major aspects of industrial agriculture are implicated in destabilising 7 of those 8 systems, not the ozone, obviously, and that was a very close-run thing. The counter to that is that if industrial ag's strongly implicated in pushing those boundaries to the Anthropocene, regenerative agriculture, and I'll touch on this later, will probably have all the best solutions available to us. It promises the most hope of really addressing those boundaries, and that to me is incredibly exciting. So just quickly, the background to my book. It's a book first full of hope and solutions and lots of wonderful stories. And so really that's all I've done is gone around Australia and interviewed a few in this room, of course, and Terry McCosker and people like that. And it really came about my own mistake-ridden journey as a farmer. If you want an expert on making mistakes in farming, I'm the expert. I set stock overgrazed country, watched it turn red in the 80s drought. I've ploughed sandy country and watched it get washed away, etc., etc. And yet I was always keen on nature, and so I was at tension with myself. And eventually, when I'd sold a merino stud, which was stopping us freely ecologically grazing, I reflected on that journey and went back to university and interviewed, and in combination now with the book, over 150 regenerative farmers to see why they'd done this paradigm or worldview shift from traditional farming to regenerative farming. And that's really what led to the book. I haven't got that on screen, but that's okay. Date of birth means you can't see all that clearly. But the book came out of that, and the key thing when I reflected on my journey was that the reason I'd belted those landscapes, other than being trained in a paradigm, was I wasn't landscape literate. I could not read my landscapes. Were they ill, how ill they were functioning, etc. And so that's really what led to what I'll describe in a minute. So I won't go into all the areas of regenerative ag I researched. Obviously, holistic grazing management, I use that because there's various terms around for it, but I think it's an holistic approach to grazing. That's why I use the term. So biological agriculture, agroforestry, etc., right across the spectrum. So really I tried to make a tapestry, and the warp threads, the main threads, were these wonderful stories of a lot of the regenerative farmers around Australia. There's some absolutely remarkable stuff. But the cross threads was really this journey of ecological literacy, which I'll describe now, because unless we can become literate, we're not going to be able to manage and read our landscapes. When you think back to when the first white settlers came to Australia, they came from Northern Europe, which was a very young land compared to ours. It was post-glacial, so its soils were chock full of nutrients because of the glaciers and the big rivers that deposited the nutrients. Very humid atmosphere, humid soils. And they developed technologies for that. And bear in mind that most of the white settlers that came hadn't been farmers anyway. And they hit this extraordinary ancient landscape of ours, up to 3.8 billion years, our soils, heavily leached over that time. So things like phosphorus, incredibly minute amounts. And so what our landscape has done over tens of millions of years is co-evolve remarkable ways of recycling these scarce nutrients, whether it's microbially under the soil or for energy and nutrients above the soil. And the other thing about this landscape, totally different to Europe, lying hidden underneath is a big salt burden from all that ancient history. We don't get the nutrients and aerosols like other continents off the ocean or from continents blowing in, dry continental interior, etc. And so these Europeans came with a different mind, and in a very short time the landscape collapsed. For instance, Western Victorian grassland took only 15 years. The salt in Western Australia which you can see there, 30, 40 years. And the dieback in New England, 130 years. So the timescales vary, but eventually it crashes if you don't handle them correctly. And the other key component of that collapse was that the mind that came out with the Europeans was totally different. To say the indigenous mind or even a medieval peasant mind. And our indigenous people and those medieval peasants, you could call that an organic mind. They still saw themselves as part of nature, earth and her cycles. Didn't see themselves as separate. Their religious ceremonies, etc., were all integrated to caring for Mother Earth. And then from the 16th century on, we went through that remarkable phase of European thinking, the Renaissance, scientific revolution, industrial revolution, and capitalist revolution. And at the end of that, particularly when you combine industrialism with capitalism, the mind that hit Australia and still reigns in economic rationalism and in our whole economic society is what you could call a mechanical mind, where we see the earth, don't see ourselves as indivisible from it, we see it as a resource for extracting for profits. And it's a huge mind shift. And so there's no empathy or understanding that came with that mind. So you could summarise it as saying the current industrial paradigm is that we see nature as the enemy, to be dominated, etc., etc. And that has all sorts of consequences. And I just put up that picture there because one of the things I did when I went doing a PhD, I looked at a lot of the advertisements that the giant multinational chemical companies were doing, employing psychologists to press the right buttons. About 2010, that was a full-page ad in all the major rural weeklies across Australia, inside cover, full back cover. So there's a fair bit of aggression with a white pointer. If you have a close look at the Roundup drum, because it's an ad for Roundup, you can see a sexy face, sexy eyelids and a smile. And the embedded language in that, which you can't read, is things like trust your killer instincts. So we were being played and still are being. And so I'm arguing that our urgent challenge is to go beyond sustainability. And I use that word because I think the word sustainable is a bit passé. To me it means marking time, whereas regenerative means open-ended improvement. And the only way, as I said, of us in wider numbers than a special audience like RCS clients is getting ecological literacy. So that was my own journey. With a different paradigm, a mechanical paradigm, I could not read that landscape was ill in terminal decline. In effect, I'd become dyslexic. It was opaque to me. And that was because I didn't understand how it functioned. So you could say it's paradigm-induced blindness. And that's a fence line in my country, lovely temperate grasslands. The farmer on the right is obviously set stocker, and the person on the left more of an ecological, holistic grazer. But it's all about, as one farmer said to me, this square foot of real estate between our ears. It's very powerful. And so really adapting work of people like Alan Savory and other ecologists, there's lots of cycles we could talk about, but simplify it down to the major four: the solar function, the water cycle, soil mineral, stuff that you guys are all familiar with, and biodiversity. But I've added that square foot of real estate to it, the human social, because it overrides the lot just through our paradigms. The key point to make is that you can't fiddle around and interfere with one cycle without all the others being destabilised and affected. And so it's all in or not at all sort of thing. I'm not going to bore you with going through the solar all the cycles, but clearly solar energy drives everything. It's the number one. Even our fossil fuels today that's built the industrial civilization. It's about really, as managers, trying to get as many solar panels on our landscape for as long as we can to punch those sugars into the soil to build carbon to feed the bugs and to bury those long-term carbon polymers, etc. So very basic and so whether it's holistic grazing, as that picture up near Bowen from RCS with one of the clients there, or the multi-stacking species like Gay Brown and those others do. It's all about trying to get as much solar panels for as long as we can and ground cover with it on our landscapes. So that's top left. If you can see the red arrow in those top left, bottom right photos, that tree is the same marker in that landscape. So you can see that's 10 years from country on the top left that had been belted, set stocked by previous owners for 100 years. 10 years later, once they'd swung over through RCS to holistic grazing, regeneration of both shrubs and grasslands, ground cover up, remarkable transformation. And that bottom left photo shows what was once a steep-sided active gully. The battens are now flattening out and it's regenerating. So we get driving through the solar energy first, and then the others, remarkable turnaround. And that's the Pierce family, just north of here. Same story. Top left, after 150 years of set stocking and fire, you've got flint-hard ground where the rain events would pour off, especially the big rains that you get up here. And that's with those two bottom photos, dry season on the left, wet season on the right. That's only 5 to 6 years later, after the management shifted from set stocking to holistic grazing management. And some of you would be familiar with this fence line contrast. A number of us here have stayed with Norman Kroon in the Karoo of South Africa. That fence line, Kroon's property on the left, that's after 35, 40 years of holistic grazing. The neighbour's place on the right, when he first bought the country, it was all like that. He had to walk a kilometre to find a perennial. We're talking about country that 400 years ago, before the Dutch and the English arrived, had rivers full of hippopotami. And now you can see the country on the left. You can see by the wheel tracks how soft and absorbent, diversity of shrubs. And he's tripled his production in country that's incredibly tough, 7 to 10 inch rainfall. And your new cropping innovators, Colin Sice, Bruce Maynard with pasture cropping and no-kill cropping, they're essentially working on the solar cycle by drilling their edible cereals and canolas into summer active C4 grasses which go dormant just as you're seeding, and then rotating holistic grazed animals through it to stimulate the ecology. And you can see the top left there, as he comes into harvest, that's an oat paddock, the C4 grasses are waking up. So he's maximising that green and the ground cover for as long as he can. And that photo in the middle is your traditional industrial cropping, well over 60% bare ground. And you can imagine at harvest in summer, there's no ground cover and the heat beating down on your valuable microbial world. Water cycle, I won't go into that, it's obvious. Once you drive the solar, you get deeper rooted variety of plants, more air pockets, more active soil biology. And it leads to an enormous increase in water holding. And that photo is one of many I could show you. 3 inches in 2 hours, that rain. The neighbour's water's pouring off. And on the left, it's all going in. And I've seen similar stories on the Monero in a 6-inch rain off the coast in 24 hours. A red basalt in set stock country running red after 2 hours. After 24 hours, the holistically grazed country was just trickling clear water. So if you think about it, here we are in the driest continent on Earth, where we often get hard rain events. In 24 hours, one neighbour tripled his effective rainfall. It's sort of pretty profound stuff. And that's a dramatic example in Mexico. That blue arrow you can see is the same point in that landscape, that hill. And on the left, there's a lot of water there, but that water had come off heavily compacted, overgrazed country. And now today, that's 27 years later, that paddock on the right would have 1,000 times more water in that landscape, even though we can't see it, just by changing the solar and water cycle through management. The soil mineral cycle, I won't build on about that because Terry's going to cover it today, but I've rejigged Elaine Ingham's soil food web there for Australian conditions. But when I went back to do a PhD, I sat in on a soil course again, 40 years since I'd done one as an undergraduate. They still concentrated on physics and chemistry. And yet soil biology is the huge story for regenerating our landscapes. Not negating that we don't need to understand cation exchange capacity and all those other factors, but this is still the missing factor in a lot of the traditional unis and their teaching on soil. And really that picture there is really just to say, picture of an iceberg, for those of you up here who can't see it, what's that got to do with soil? Well, really, a really healthy soil, if you weighed your animals sitting on top of the ground, you should have an iceberg look about what's under the ground, up to 8 or 9 times more biomass under the ground as on top if you really get your soils going. So that's sort of a benchmark we can think about, and those other photos are the real goodies in the micro world, the mycorrhizal fungi and the valuable bacteria that do a lot of the work, but there's plenty of others. That red arrow is where the soil surface was in the Mallee. Now, when I was young and silly, I used to do a fair bit of mountaineering and climbing. And in the early 70s, I was climbing with a Kiwi in the upper Tasman Glacier. And we're carrying heavy packs, and we stopped for a rest. And I noticed this red ice, and I dug around. And I said, "What's this, a lichen?" And fairly aggressively, he said, "No, that's your bloody Mallee drought of the 30s. And he was right. Millions of tonnes of soil from pastoral country up in Broken Hill and South Australia, Mallee, Wimmera, crossed up to 4,000 k's and turned New Zealand Alps red. And that's happened on 4 other occasions. And I don't know about you, I mean, I'm sick of being beaten by the All Blacks. We certainly don't need to give them our minerals as well. And it's not just the past. When I was doing some research, that's 2011, I cut across the head of the Liverpool Plains. I wanted to talk to a guy up under that Blue Range. It's a pretty dry year, and there'd been 8 mils the night before. So this is 12 hours later, and I just stopped. So I walked over and hopped over. There's a fence behind that railway line. And that soil was so heavily capped and lacking in structure because it had been so overworked, so oversprayed, so over-fertilised. Water that should have disappeared in 5 minutes was there 12 hours later. And a lot of the research now into these cycles shows that if we can just put 1% more carbon in the soil, we can store an extra more than 140,000 litres of water per hectare just by doing that. Now, as I said, having done a bit of climbing, anyone who's done a bit of climbing knows that you hate down climbing. You can't see where you're going, usually tired. It's much easier to climb up. That mountain goat has down climbed 200 metres to get his daily dose of necessary mineral salts. That's how important minerals are to us. So we don't want to stuff up that cycling. And that's, I remember my youthful days. I'd proudly put in a monoculture of oats, good dose of superphosphate, put on the weaner steers or boost and ewes before joining. And within a few weeks, they were starting to scour. And then the bastards would do that. And I would say, why are they so stupid? But as I'll discuss briefly later, even our domestic animals are hardwired through a long period of co-evolution to detect hundreds of nutrients, whether medicine or nutrients. And that cow knows that out in that forb or thistle, there's a lot more nutrients than the monoculture on the left. So it wasn't the animals that were stupid. And the fourth biophysical system is obviously biodiversity. I won't go into that, but the importance of having functional diversity for bird, pests, parasitic wasps, etc. control is fundamental. And some pretty obvious economic benefits I'll just show you here from the Stewart family in agroforestry in Western Victoria. Top left, when he started, his country had gone down to 2% vegetation from what was originally over 80. That strainer post is the common marker in all 3 photos. And on the bottom photo, that's 6 years later. And the bottom right photo is early this year. Now, he's now running on 18% less land. He's taken his vegetation up to 20%. He's now running more animals, doing it better lambings and calvings and performance than even with the 18% out. But on top of that, he's stacked in 6 or 7 commercial enterprises. not just in different types of forestry. He's now harvesting saw logs that have been managed $3,000 or $4,000 a pop per tree. He's got bush tucker. He's got his wife's got a major business with cut flowers, farm tourism and stuff. So the resilience of that farm through shifting to more biodiverse, healthy, functioning landscape is enormous right across the board, socially, economic, ecologically. Looking at this biodiversity story, down our way, legumes like tree lucerne, deep-rooted perennials bring up a lot of nutrients, 24% protein, fixing nitrogen. We now know in the alleyway systems like this that deep root system is working. They're now finding some of those minerals 2 or 3, 4 metres out into the grassland alleyways. And you've got Leukina up here as well. I know there's a few problems, but similar stories. So we tended to think horizontally, but vertical vegetation browsing, which our domestic animals are adapted for, you don't get intestinal worm eggs on them, etc., and they're getting a whole range of potentially thousands more nutrients. And we don't have to tell the Spanish and the Portuguese with their Tehesa and Montados. They've been doing it for hundreds of years and stacking 6 or 7 enterprises into those landscapes. So the final landscape function is the square foot of real estate, the human social, and this really comes down to the paradigms and world views that we grew up with, like I did. 22-year-old taking over a farm, I asked all the best farmers, CSIRO, Department of Ag, and so I was well and truly inducted into the industrial paradigm, and it's very powerful, and RCS has been one of the leaders in confronting those issues and working out how we can get around it. And those paradigms are what preclude our ecological literacy, capacity to read a landscape. And so really there's that classic illustration, that fence line, the mechanical mind, economic rationalism drives one and not the other. Now, going back to uni after 40 years, I had a big catch-up to do. In ecology, that we'd had computers, systems thinking, a lot of new physics thinking and chaos. And out of it came an understanding of what they now call complex adaptive systems, whether it's something like the Earth system or our own farm or a catchment, or the World Wide Web. These are very complex systems. If they're destabilised or if a new input comes in, like, say, someone inventing Facebook to go on the web, the system has a capacity because of its complexity to adjust. And I won't go into it. I've taught masters and other students on it. You can teach a whole course on it. There's about 12 basic factors to do with it. The one I want to focus on is this concept of self-organisation, that natural systems, and even the World Wide Web, have an inbuilt capacity that if they're destabilised or there's a new factor, whether it's a drought or change in management, to reorganise and, if allowed, to reorganise back to health or resilience. And to me that's an extraordinary new concept. And I kept meeting these leading regenerative farmers who said, look, my job is to get out of the way of Mother Nature. And I thought about that for a couple of years and it suddenly clicked. My job was to let natural systems self-organise back to a better state. And I think that's an extremely exciting concept. And so I'll wrap up with a few more ideas, but really, yes, as this RCS fridge sticker says, you know, we farmers can be heroes of the future if we enable self-organisation to occur. I'll just give you a few examples. Paul Hawken has been one of the leading writers in social and environmental change worldwide for a long while, and I met him over a month ago in Melbourne, and he's just edited this major book. It's taken 8-9 years, hundreds of scientists, called Drawdown, the best 100 ways, fully costed by all these hundreds of people across the world, the best way to either restrict carbon going up or to pull it down. Number one, you'll see there, if we rejig refrigeration, we'd pull out over 90 gigatons or stop it going up. And in Melbourne, he only spoke about the top 20. And in those top 20, there are 5 regenerative ag that he'd separated. Holistic grazing, agroforestry, food forestry, biological ag. And I said to him, what happens if you call them regenerative ag, put them together? Regenerative ag becomes number one by about 40%. And he said, shit, you're right. And that is an extraordinary That's why I said at the start that, yes, we've destabilised the systems with industrial ag and our previous practices of civilisation, but regenerative ag, more than anything else going, has the potential to start turning around those Anthropocene problems. And that's just in carbon. And that's an extraordinary, empowering and exciting thing, I would have thought. And we're starting to get numbers on it. John Ive, as an ex-CSIRO guy, he and his wife bought a rundown farm out of Canberra. The ridges have been cleared, so there's no recharge going into the groundwater. He revegetated them, got his ground cover up, and it's the first farm now being studied by a university team. And they've found that in the last 30 years, he has sequestered more soil carbon than 11 times more than his total farm emissions in that period. And he's moved his soil carbon from 1% to 4% just by doing those basic regenerative functions. And that's exactly what Hawkins was talking about the drawdown potential we've got. And this, I think, is one of the biggies for us in the way we can contribute in the future, and that's through human health. How we can lead to humanity healing itself. Now, a lot of people, and I certainly didn't, we co-evolved in the African savannah for 1 million years or more, the modern humans. So the women hunter-gatherers, as in any major indigenous community today, the women can recognise up to more than 500 medicinal plant species, so they'd go off gathering, and the men would go off hunting. But they didn't just hunt meat. They hunted animals that were browsing a landscape and grazing pastures. And the browse landscapes, the shrubs, as I'll point you out in a minute, have tens of thousands of nutrients in them. So when we get some extreme food fads going, it says you don't need meat. Well, they're wrong, because there's elements in meat off a healthy landscape you won't get from tons and tons of just eating vegetables. And that goes back to our prehistory and the way we co-evolved. And beef particularly important. So that's another view you could look at with the way we're going with human evolution, if you like. 5 minutes. Unfortunately, it's a bit, it's not as funny as it looks. And look, I'll just quickly touch it. I've worked with a wonderful professor in Utah State Uni, now retired, looked at animals in grazing landscapes. The shrubs have tens of thousands of different nutrients, you know, whether they're terpenes or phenols or whatever. Australian wattles have a lot of tannin in them, quite useful with some species for self-medication for intestinal worms, for example. We haven't looked at some of those capacities. And so for herbivores, eating a variety of foods in a variety of places has huge consequences for us if we're eating meat and food off those landscapes. Just quickly to summarise, the research now showing what we've done with modern breeding, dwarf wheats bred to be drug addicts for maximum production. The nutrients, compared to previous 40, 50 years ago, have just crashed. A lot of the major nutrients critical to our health, magnesium, selenium, those sorts of things. There's a cost. You can't keep pushing a boundary and killing your soils at the same time. And there's plenty of research to show that's just a research on the modern bred wheats, 60 varieties, huge crashes in those key nutrients. And the same is happening with vegetables and fruits. Huge crashes, you know, breeding for cosmetics, breeding for maximum production, poisoning the soils, which shuts down the biology that accesses it. The nutrients are crashing. And this, we're evolved to have a diversity of rich nutrients. Where a lot of the modern disease is coming from, particularly the immune stuff, this is one of the big factors. So, finishing up, 2,500 years ago, the guy that gave us the modern medical ethics, Hippocrates, attributed to him nearly 2,500 years ago, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. It is such a powerful statement. And I'll just finally touch on something that I think is enormous, and that is glyphosate, Roundup. It's now approaching 1 billion tonnes in use annually, the world's most widely used herbicide, so we're reliant on it. I won't waste time on this, but the tracking from once GM got going in corn and soy with things like autism is about a 95% correlation since the early 90s. That's not just chance. In science, that's quite extraordinary. And you won't be able to read the writing here, but there's a lot of stuff now coming out to show that this is probably the most dangerous chemical in our environment. And these researchers here, Samsel and Sennett, reviewed nearly 290 research papers in biology, medicine and medical biology. And they're saying it's the most dangerous chemical in our environment. It's got into all our industrial modern food, into baby's milk. And aside from what it's doing to the soil biology, which is horrendous, the main thing they're saying is it's attacking our gut microbiome, the very front line of our entire immune system, interfering with the amino acid takedown. So, personally, I think this is bigger than tobacco. It's that crucial if it really breaks. And finally, I'll just touch quickly opportunities for what we're talking about. Obviously, $200 million recently for the barrier reef because of the nutrient flow in. Well, talking to Terry last night, a lot of the solutions within this group and this practice are already there if allowed. And won't go into the new market issue, but I just think this new space for healthy food, organic food, meat chock full of nutrients, which even the best vegetable growers can't provide, say, non-heme iron for pregnant mothers. You'd have to eat tons of vegetables equivalent to a beautiful grass-fed beef off the landscape to get that sort of iron that's badly needed. There's just so many good stories. And so, yeah, we farmers can be heroes of the future, and I just would like to acknowledge the role that Terry and Pam and team and David before them. I know I'm not paid by RCS, but I accepted this invitation with alacrity because of this theme I hold them in changing probably more hectares and more lives than virtually anything going on in Australia. So very quickly, wrapping it up. As a species in the planet, yes, we are standing on the edge, in my view. And we could get depressed about it, or go down the pub and sing Monty Python's Galaxy song. So remember, when you're feeling very small and insecure, how amazingly unlikely is your birth, and pray that there's intelligent life somewhere in space, because there's bugger all down here on Earth. I don't subscribe to that. I think agriculture will be front and centre to our futures. Yeah, we're part of the problem, but by gee, we're part of the solution. And the key solution is through working those landscape functions, let self-organisation play its role. And so, finally, a wonderful environmental historian, Donald Worcester, has given us 3 principles for good farming: making people healthier, promoting a just society, and preserving the earth and its network of life. And we can turn challenges into opportunities through the things I've talking about, which I won't reiterate now. So we need a new story for our times, because the story of growth and greed has failed us. And attributed to Dietrich Bonhoeffer is the saying that his quote, "The ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world it leaves to its children." Thank you.